In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate. Welcome to the Missing Dots. Today on the Missing Dots, we step into one of the most debated and least discussed chapters of Islamic history, the life, legacy, and controversy surrounding Imam Jafar Sadiq. Was he simply a towering scholar of his era, or the figure whose teachings shaped an entirely new sect within Islam? Did he divide the Muslim community, or was he responding to a division already unfolding? Why did people adopt his school of thought so rapidly, and what unique features set his sect apart? Did his approach open the doors of inquiry or quietly close them? From free thinking to scientific contributions, from sectarian expansion to modern-day criticism, today we confront 100 taboo questions raised by Sunnis, Shia, Salafists, ex-Muslims, and atheists, and examine how classical and modern scholars defend these issues. Stay with me, because tonight we connect the dots that history rarely allows us to see.
You know, if you just imagine a single dusty courtyard in 8th century Medina, just picture it. In this one space, you have the men who will eventually write the foundational legal code for 90% of the modern Muslim world.
Right.
And they are sitting shoulder to shoulder with the man who will go on to basically invent the experimental method of modern chemistry.
Wait, really? In the same courtyard?
In the exact same courtyard.
Yeah.
And they're all sitting cross-legged, furiously taking notes from the exact same teacher. A teacher, by the way, that the government is actively trying to erase from the public sphere.
Honestly, it sounds like a movie script. I mean, looking at the huge stack of PhD-level research and the historical sources on the desk in front of us today, that courtyard was entirely real.
Oh, absolutely real.
And the man at the center of it, Imam Jafar al-Sadiq, is maybe the single most complex figure we have ever analyzed on this show. Because, you know, if you're listening to this right now, regardless of your background, you probably know that the Muslim world today is broadly split into Sunni and Shia.
Sure, everyone knows the basic map.
Yeah, but the thing is, we almost never look at the actual mechanics of how those boundaries were drawn, or the intellectual battles that were happening while the ink was still drying, you know?
We really rarely do. And I think it's mostly because we tend to project our modern political maps backward onto history. We see these rigid, institutionalized borders today, and we just assume it was always exactly like that.
Right, like they woke up one day and picked a team.
Exactly. But the sources we're looking at today put a completely different picture of the 8th century. It was a time of absolute, just terrifying intellectual and political upheaval.
And our mission today is to cut through all of that noise. We have this massive compilation of academic data, theological critiques, secular historical analyses, and even polemical arguments. We are putting it all on the table.
No taking sides.
No taking sides at all, and no sugarcoating the uncomfortable parts either. I want to start with the heaviest accusation that we see in the critical literature. The narrative from various polemicists and even some mainstream historical summaries is that Jafar al-Sadiq was this great divider.
Right, the idea that he fractured everything.
Yeah, the argument goes that Islam was this unified monolith until he came along, drew a line in the sand, and deliberately fractured the community just to consolidate power.
It is definitely the most common starting point for critics, but when we cross-reference that claim with the actual historical timeline in our sources, the narrative just instantly disintegrates.
Yeah, I have to say, after reading through the timeline myself, blaming Jafar al-Sadiq for dividing Islam feels a bit like blaming someone born in 1950 for starting World War I.
That is actually a perfect analogy.
The math just doesn't add up. It's actually pretty simple when you look at the calendar, but maybe walk us through the actual dates.
Let's lay the dates out, because they are literally everything here. The Prophet Muhammad passed away in 632 CE, and the very first moment of fracture happens, literally before he is even buried.
Oh, wow. Before the burial.
Yeah, at a gathering place called Saqifa. This is where the dispute over succession ignites. The core question was, should the leadership of the Muslim community be determined by communal consensus, which, resulted in Abu Bakr becoming the first caliph? Or was there a divine designation?
What they call a nas, right?
Exactly, a nas pointing specifically to the Prophet's family, the Al-Bayt, particularly his cousin and son-in-law, Ali ibn Abi Talib.
So the actual seed of the Sunni-Shia divide is planted right there in 632 CE, not a century later.
Yes, and that seed didn't just sit dormant, It grew into an incredibly violent series of civil wars known as the Fitnas. By 656 CE, you have the Battle of Jamal.
Right, that's where Ali is fighting forces led by Isha.
Exactly, the Prophet's widow. The trauma of that was just immense for the early Muslims. Then, the very next year, 657 CE, you have the Battle of Siffin. Ali faces off against Murayya, the governor of Syria.
And that battle caused even more splintering, didn't it?
It did. That single battle was so violently fracturing that it caused a third, entirely separate splinter group to emerge, the Khawarij, who basically rebelled against absolutely everyone.
And we haven't even reached the most traumatic event yet in the timeline.
No, we haven't. The event that completely shatters any remaining illusion of a unified community happens in 680 CE, the tragedy of Karbala.
Right.
The Prophet's grandson, Hussein ibn Ali, along with dozens of his family members and companions, are brutally massacred by the massive army of the Umayyad Caliph Yazid. And we really have to pause and understand the sociological impact of Karbala.
Because it wasn't just a military defeat.
Not at all. It was a psychological earthquake. It permanently solidified a distinct, grieving, and politically marginalized identity for those loyal to the Prophet's family.
Okay, so let's just look at the math here. 632, 656, 657, 680. All of these massive, bloody, community-shattering events. And our sources say Imam Jafar al-Sadiq was born in what year?
702 CE.
702, meaning by the time he took his very first breath as an infant, the theological and political divide over succession, leadership, and religious authority was already, what, 3 generations deep?
3 generations easily.
The blood had been dried on the sand for decades before he even existed.
That is the historical reality. By the time he assumed the role of Imam, which is the spiritual guide for those loyal to the Al-Bayt around 732 CE, the Umayyad Caliphate was an entrenched superpower.
And they were not friendly to his family.
Oh, not at all. They had spent decades actively hunting and suppressing the followers of Ali. So the claim that Jafar al-Sadiq somehow created the division is a complete historical fiction. He inherited a deeply fractured world.
But hold on, let me push back here on behalf of the critics. Because, a secular historian or an ex-Muslim commentator looking at this data might say, fine, he didn't start the fire, but he absolutely built the walls.
Right. They argue he formalized it.
Exactly. They argue that by creating a totally distinct school of jurisprudence, and by hyper-emphasizing doctrines centered around his own family, he formalized a split that maybe, over time, could have naturally healed. Some even suggest this is just a sophisticated power struggle disguised as theology.
That's a very common secular critique.
So how does the historical record respond to the idea that he purposefully cemented the divide just for his own gain?
Well, to answer that, we have to look at how he actually behaved politically. If he were seeking power, he would have done what many of his relatives were doing at the exact same time, raising an army.
But he didn't do that.
He didn't. Jafar al-Sadiq practiced a profound philosophy of political quietism, which is known in the tradition as sakina.
Quietism meaning he just completely stayed out of the government's way.
He deliberately removed himself from the political arena, and you really have to understand the pressure he was under to do the exact opposite.
Because the government was weak at that point.
Exactly. During his lifetime, the Umayyad dynasty was rotting from the inside, and the Abbasid revolution was gaining momentum. It was a time of chaotic, bloody opportunity. Many figures from the Al-Bayt believe that the only righteous response to Umayyad tyranny was armed, violent rebellion.
Like his uncle. Right.
Yes, his own uncle Zayd ibn Ali led a massive revolt in 740 CE.
And did Jafar support his uncle's rebellion? The sources say no, right?
He explicitly advised against it. While he deeply respected Zayd's personal piety and courage, Jafar warned him that the revolt would fail and only lead to further massacre of their community.
And he was right.
Tragically, he was entirely correct. Zayd was killed and his body was publicly crucified. In the wake of this, Jafar al-Sadiq made a paradigm-shifting theological maneuver. He explicitly separated spiritual authority, the imama, from temporal political power, the khilafah.
I really want to make sure the listener absorbs that because it's massive. He basically said, you can have the throne, you can have the military, you can collect the taxes. I am stepping out of the Game of Thrones to focus exclusively on preserving the intellectual core of the faith.
SubhanAllah, it was the specific maneuver that saved his followers from total eradication. Because when the Abbasids finally overthrew the Umayyads, they didn't share power.
Right, they just took over.
And they turned out to be just as paranoid and ruthless toward the Al-Bayt as the Umayyads had been. If Jafar had been trying to build a political movement, the Abbasids would have wiped them off the map. Instead, he built an academy.
Okay, this brings us to the next section of our research, because this is where the story pivots from just basic survival to an absolute explosion of influence. If he isn't leading a political rebellion, What on earth is he doing that makes his movement spread with such incredible speed?
It really was an explosion.
The data shows he had thousands of students. How does a politically marginalized guy in Medina suddenly attract the equivalent of a modern university enrollment?
It comes down to a geopolitical anomaly. Historians call it the golden window of early Islamic scholarship. Around 750 CE, the Umayyads and the Abbasids were locked in a brutal, all-consuming death match for control of the empire.
So the state was completely distracted.
Entirely distracted. A rare vacuum of power opened up in Medina. The state security apparatus wasn't actively policing scholars or dictating theology the way they had before, or the way they inevitably would again later.
And he just stepped into that vacuum.
Jafar seized that distraction intellectually. He opened his academy, and the scale of it is just staggering. Contemporary sources record that he had upward of 4,000 students passing through his lectures.
Let me stop you right there, because an atheist critic looking at this quick adoption is going to see something very different.
Oh, absolutely. They see opportunism.
Yeah, they look at 4,000 students flocking to a guy during a civil war and say, this is pure political opportunism. They argue that he just took advantage of the chaos to build a cult of personality, sweeping up people who were angry at the government. How do we know this wasn't just a populist echo chamber?
We know it wasn't an echo chamber by looking at the enrollment roster. Who was actually sitting in that courtyard? Mashallah, it was an astonishingly cross-sectarian intellectual hub.
Really? It wasn't just his own followers?
Not at all. The founders of the two largest Sunni schools of jurisprudence today, Abu Hanifa and Malik ibn Anas, were sitting in his classes studying under him.
Wait, just to make sure the listener grasps this. The people who wrote the legal software for 90% of the modern Muslim world learned how to code in a classroom run by the founding figure of the other 10%.
That is historically accurate. Abu Hanifa famously stated, "I have not seen anyone more knowledgeable than Jafar ibn Muhammad." And to be clear, they didn't just sit there nodding passively.
They pushed back.
They had rigorous, intense debates about legal methodology and the use of analogy in law, but the mutual respect was undeniable. People were not flocking to Jafar al-Sadiq because he was a populist political alternative. They were coming because he was recognized as a generational genius.
He offered a coherent system during chaos.
Exactly. He offered an intellectually rigorous system of law and ethics during a terrifyingly chaotic time.
And the research notes that he wasn't just teaching theology. He was teaching what we would now consider the hard sciences, right?
Yes, and this is critical to understanding the draw of his academy. He taught natural philosophy, early astronomy, medicine, and chemistry. His most famous student in this realm was Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in the West as Geber.
The Jabir ibn Hayyan, the guy who literally invented the experimental method of distillation, crystallization, and the early precursors to the scientific method.
The very same. Jabir explicitly credited Imam Jafar for providing the foundational rationalist framework that allowed him to move science away from purely theoretical, mystical Greek alchemy into practical, experimental, cause and effect observation. Wow.
So when critics ask why people adopted his school so quickly, the answer is that it was an intellectual powerhouse. It was the premier academic institution of its day.
Okay, I hear that. But this massive influx of students is what ultimately led to the formalization of the Jafari School of Jurisprudence. And here's where we have to tackle the truly taboo stuff in the research.
The controversial rulings.
Yeah, because this school has rules that are distinctly different from the Sunni majority. And critics, both traditionalists, Sunnis, and secular ex-Muslims, point to these distinct rulings and say, look, this isn't rigorous scholarship. These are dangerous innovations. He just made the rules easier to attract followers or gave them religious loopholes to behave badly.
It is the most common polemical tactic. Whenever a minority tradition differs from the majority practice, those differences are weaponized as proof of deviance. And the Jafari school does have distinct features, from how they calculate inheritance to how they perform ritual ablution. Let's not dance around it. The two practices that our sources highlight as the biggest lightning rods are Mut'ah and Taqiyya, temporary marriage, and the religious allowance to hide your faith.
Right, those are the big two.
Honestly, if I'm a critic looking at this from the outside, it is incredibly easy to see why people attack this. It looks like a massive, cynical loophole system. Here's a rule that lets you sleep around legally, and here's a rule that lets you lie whenever it's convenient. How on earth do the defenders of this tradition explain these away?
Well, they don't explain them away. They root them fiercely in early Islamic history and the Quran itself. But you're right, viewed through a modern, cynical lens without the historical mechanics, they look terrible. Let's deconstruct Mut'ah, temporary marriage, first.
Please do, because the loudest critique is that it's just a religious cover for illicit behavior, a sanctioned way to bypass the moral weight of actual marriage.
The Jafari defense of Mut'ah is strictly textual. They argue that this practice was explicitly permitted in the Quran, specifically referencing verse 4.24, and that it was actively, undeniably practiced during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad and the reign of the first Caliph, Abu Bakr.
Wait, so it isn't something Jafar al-Sadiq just invented in the 8th century to be popular?
Absolutely not. And mainstream Sunni historians do not dispute that it existed during the Prophet's time. The theological debate is over whether it was later abrogated, meaning canceled out by later rulings.
Okay, so the Sunni view is that it was canceled.
Sunni jurisprudence generally holds that the practice was eventually forbidden and definitively banned by the second Caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab.
And the Jafari school disagrees with that ban.
Fundamentally, they argue that a caliph acting as a political leader does not have the theological authority to ban something that was permitted by the Prophet and sanctioned by the Quran. So from their perspective, they are simply maintaining an original, unaltered practice.
Okay, I understand the historical argument for keeping it, but what about the moral accusation? How do they defend against the charge that it's just a relaxation of morals?
Jafari jurists vehemently reject the caricature of it being a free-for-all. They argue that human nature is complex, and rigid laws that don't account for extreme edge cases inevitably lead to societal collapse. They view Mut'ah not as a loophole for fun, but as a highly regulated, pragmatic mercy designed specifically to prevent outright sin, which is zina or fornication.
What do you mean by highly regulated? Because the stereotype is just, I marry you for an hour, here is some money.
The actual jurisprudence is incredibly strict. It requires a formal spoken contract. It requires mutual explicit consent. It requires a specified dowry. And critically, this is the part critics often ignore, it requires a waiting period, an iddah, at the end of the term.
Why is the waiting period important?
Because the primary purpose of the waiting period is to ensure clarity of paternity if a child is conceived. If a child results from a temporary marriage, that child is entirely legitimate, carries the father's name, and is entitled to full inheritance rights exactly the same as a child from a permanent marriage.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
The father has full financial obligation. It is a legally binding structure. They argue it is a realistic legal mechanism for situations where a permanent marriage is simply impossible, like long-term travel or extreme financial hardship, recognizing human biological realities while forcing them to remain within an ethical, legally accountable framework.
I never thought about it that way. When you explain the legal obligations regarding children and inheritance, it stops sounding like a loophole and starts sounding like a structural safety net for edge cases.
Exactly.
But let's move to the second taboo, Taqiyya. The concept of hiding your faith. I think to a lot of people, the idea that a religion would explicitly permit you to lie about what you believe sounds inherently deceptive, maybe even cowardly.
And again, context and the actual mechanics of the law are everything here. Taqiyya is not an allowance for everyday deception. You cannot use it to cheat in business, or lie to your spouse, or win a theological debate.
So it has strict limits.
It is a highly specific, Quranically sanctioned survival tactic. The primary textual basis is verse 16.1-6, which excuses a believer who utters words of disbelief under extreme physical duress while their heart remains firm in faith.
So it's about physical survival, not convenience.
It is about life and death. It is only permitted and sometimes obligated when a person's life or the lives of their family and community are in imminent mortal danger.
And they were in danger back then.
Oh, we have to go back to the geopolitics of the 8th century to understand why this became so prominent in the Jafari school. The Abbasid Caliphate, despite initially gaining power by claiming they would restore the rights of the Prophet's family, became unspeakably brutal toward the Al-Bayt and their followers.
How bad was it? Like, what were they actually doing?
They hunted them down, they imprisoned them in horrific conditions, they executed their scholars. Historical sources indicate that the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur, terrified of Imam Jafar's immense popularity and intellectual influence, eventually had the Imam himself poisoned.
Wait, poisoned?
Yes. So Taqiyya wasn't a trip, it was theological encryption. You're outwardly broadcasting a public signal to satisfy the government's firewall while maintaining a private, encrypted network underneath, just so your community doesn't get eradicated.
That's a fascinating way to put it. But how do they actually practice it? Did they just lie if a guard asked them a direct question?
It was far more systemic than that. It involved integrating into the dominant society to avoid detection. They would pray according to the state-sanctioned Sunni physical rituals when in public mosques. They would hide their distinct theological manuscripts.
Just to blend in.
Right. They would outwardly praise figures they privately disagreed with if refusing to do so meant execution. Critics call it deception. Defenders call it pragmatic, scripturally grounded self-preservation in the face of state terrorism.
Because if they stood out, they'd be killed.
If they had walked around Medina and Baghdad publicly proclaiming their allegiance to the imams, they would have simply been slaughtered, and the intellectual tradition would have died with them.
That reframes things significantly. It's the difference between a con artist lying for money and a resistance fighter lying to the Gestapo to hide refugees in the attic. The intent changes the moral weight entirely.
Precisely.
But as we dig deeper into the sources, there is another pillar of Jafari jurisprudence that feels less about physical survival and more about profound intellectual philosophy. And it's the concept of aqwal, or reason. The research suggests this is the true engine of the Jafari school.
It is the defining methodological heartbeat of their entire legal and theological system. In the Jafari legal system, specifically the dominant Usuli school reason, or aqwal, is recognized as an independent foundational source of law.
Right alongside the Quran.
Right alongside the Quran, the traditions of the Prophet and Imams, and scholarly consensus.
I need to ask a clarifying question here, though. Doesn't every Islamic legal school use reason? The Sunni schools aren't just flipping coins to make decisions.
Of course, all schools use reason, logic, and analogy to deduce laws. But historically, a major divergence happened. The prominent Sunni legal schools eventually went through a long, complex historical process that is often described in academic literature as closing the gates of ijtihad.
Ijtihad, meaning independent original legal reasoning. Why would they close the gates?
The prevailing thought was that the foundational giants men like Abu Hanifa, Malik, Shafi'i, and Ahmad ibn Hanbal had already answered the major foundational legal questions. They had established the methodologies.
So they didn't need new ones.
Right. Therefore, subsequent generations of scholars should primarily rely on taqlid, which means imitator or following the established precedents of those early masters, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel from scratch.
So relying heavily on historical precedent to maintain stability.
Exactly. But the Jafari school, specifically the Usuli branch, which eventually won out over their more text-literalist rivals known as the Akbaris, fundamentally rejected the idea that the gates of ijtihad could ever be closed.
Wait, they kept them open?
Permanently. In their system, it is actually forbidden for a layperson to follow the rulings of a deceased scholar on a new, modern issue.
Wait, forbidden? They can't just look up what a scholar from the 16th century said.
Not for unprecedented modern issues. They believe a living community requires living guidance. A follower must attach themselves to a living, highly qualified supreme scholar known as a marja.
A marja.
This marja must be actively alive, actively using his intellect, his aql, to deduce rulings from the original sources for the world as it exists today.
That is fascinating. It basically builds an automatic software update into the religion.
That's a good way to look at it.
If you encounter a problem that literally didn't exist in the 8th century, like cryptocurrency or cloning or in vitro fertilization, you have a living scholar actively applying rigorous reason to figure it out, rather than trying to stretch a 1,200-year-old ruling about bartering wheat to cover Bitcoin.
It makes the jurisprudence incredibly elastic and dynamic. It ensures the law is always interacting with the present reality. But as you might expect, this massive emphasis on human intellect raises a profound theological tension.
A paradox, right?
A paradox that every single critic of the tradition aggressively points out.
Let me guess the paradox. How do you reconcile a system that says, question everything, use your intellect, constantly apply reason to modern problems, with a theological foundation that says, here is a lineage of infallible imams whose word is absolute and divine?
That is precisely the tension. The doctrines of Nas divine designation of the imam and isma, absolute infallibility of the imam.
Right. Let me push back hard on this, because a secular critic or an atheist reading this research is going to laugh at this combination. They'll say, wait, hold on. You're telling me this system demands absolute critical thinking, but also says, here's a guy you can literally never disagree with. That sounds like a rigged game.
It does sound like a contradiction at first glance.
Yeah. How is that not just an intellectual dictatorship dressed up as free thinking?
It is the central philosophical knot of Shia theology. And the Jafari scholars do not shy away from it. They lean entirely into it. Their defense lies in their fundamental understanding of the source of both human reason and divine revelation.
What do you mean?
Theologians in this tradition, heavily influenced by later philosophers like Mulla Sadra, argue that human reason, when properly trained, purified of bias, and applied logically in divine revelation, cannot possibly contradict one another.
Because they come from the same place.
Because they originate from the exact same source, God.
So if I use my logic and I find a contradiction with a religious text, what happens? Who wins?
The Jafari scholar would say one of two things must be true. Either your logic is flawed and you've made an error in your reasoning, or your understanding of the text is flawed and you are misinterpreting it.
It's interesting.
The infallible imam isn't there to suppress your reason or act as a dictator. The imam is there to perfectly embody reason and guide it. They view the imam as the ultimate, uncorrupted manifestation of the divine intellect on earth.
So submitting to the imam.
Therefore, submitting to the guidance of the imam isn't an abandonment of your reason. It is the highest, most logical conclusion your reason can reach.
Following the imam is the highest conclusion of reason. That is a dense, deeply philosophical stance. But it begs a very practical, data-driven question from our sources.
Go ahead.
If the Jafari school elevates reason, critical thinking, and aql so highly, we have to look at the receipts. What has this intellectual framework actually produced in the real world over the last 1,300 years?
It is the inevitable next question. And it's one that atheist and secular critics love to ask, often framing it in very modern quantitative terms to try and debunk the theology.
Yeah, let's ask the uncomfortable question that dominates online debates. Atheist critics look at the claims of intellectual superiority and ask, if this sect is the ultimate truth based on intellect, where are the Nobels?
Right. The Nobel Prize argument.
Why hasn't this specific rationalist tradition produced a massive list of modern scientific miracles and breakthroughs that completely dwarf the rest of the world?
It is a provocative, aggressive question, and to unpack it impartially, our research requires us to separate 8th century theology from modern geopolitical and institutional realities. Let's address the Nobel Prize argument directly, because the sociologists in our sources are very clear on how flawed this metric is.
Why is it flawed? It seems like a pretty standard way we measure scientific success today.
Methodologically, it is deeply problematic for a few reasons. First, there is no authoritative, disaggregated global data set that tracks Nobel Prizes by a specific Islamic sect. You can't just pull up a spreadsheet of Sunni versus Shia physicists.
That's true. They don't ask your sect when you win.
Exactly. But more importantly, counting Nobel Prizes as a measure of an 8th century theology's validity is completely anachronistic.
Explain that. Why does it correlate?
Because Muslims globally, across all sects and denominations, have relatively few science Nobel Prizes compared to the West. And global scholars universally attribute this deficit not to Islamic theology, but to brutal, modern, post-colonial realities.
Like lack of funding.
Yes, we are talking about severe gaps in institutional funding, a massive lack of educational infrastructure, the constant brain drain of top scientists fleeing to Western universities, and unrelenting geopolitical instability in Muslim-majority countries over the last century.
Right. So judging a 1,300-year-old theological framework by a Western scientific prize, awarded mostly in the 20th and 21st centuries, is basically comparing apples to spaceships.
That's a good way to put it.
It ignores the fact that science requires billions of dollars of stable infrastructure, not just a good theology.
Exactly. Though impartially, it is worth noting that individuals from Jafari backgrounds have won major global awards. Shirin Ebadi, an Iranian Shia, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2003, and Maryam Mirzakhani, also from Iran, won the Fields Medal, which is the mathematical equivalent of the Nobel.
Right, but those are individual cases.
Yes, and attributing these individual achievements solely to their sectarian background is just as methodologically weak as blaming the theology for the lack of total awards.
Fair enough. The Nobel argument is a modern distraction. But if we put that aside and look historically, did this school of thought actually produce the rationalists and scientists it claims to? Does the history back up the philosophy?
Historically, the output is undeniable and massive. We already discussed Jabir ibn Hayyan emerging directly from Imam Jafar's circle to pioneer chemistry, but the tradition continued to foster giants of early empirical science and philosophy for centuries.
Who else?
You have figures like Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, an absolute polymath who made foundational contributions to astronomy, trigonometry, and biology in the 13th century, Or Mullah Sadra in the 17th century, who created one of the most ambitious, complex philosophical syntheses in human history.
Blending rationalism and mysticism.
Yes, merging hard rationalism, mysticism, and textual theology.
Why did these specific figures thrive in a Jafari environment? Was there something specific about the theology that acted as a fertilizer for this kind of thinking?
Yes. And this is perhaps one of the most fascinating points raised by historians of Islamic philosophy in our research. The Jafari tradition generally rejected a dominant theological concept known as Ash'ari occasionalism.
Okay, let's slow down and really unpack occasionalism, because this concept breaks my brain a little bit. What exactly is it?
The Ash'ari theological school, which became incredibly dominant in many mainstream Sunni regions, argued that God is the direct, immediate cause of every single event in the universe, at every single millisecond.
Okay, give me an example. Explain it like I'm 5.
Imagine you drop a glass on a tile floor and it shatters. From a standard scientific perspective, gravity pulled the glass, the impact force exceeded the structural integrity of the glass, and it broke. Cause and effect.
Right. Basic physics.
The strict Ash'ari occasionalist view says no. Gravity didn't pull it, and the floor didn't break it. God specifically created the shattering of the glass at the exact millisecond it touched the floor.
Wait, really?
Yes. Fire doesn't cause cotton to burn. God causes the cotton to burn when the fire is near it.
So it completely denies independent cause and effect in nature.
Completely. The laws of nature are just God's habits, and he can change those habits at any given second. Now, think about the implication for science. If you believe that, why bother studying physics or chemistry?
Because it can change tomorrow.
Exactly. You can't scientifically study a habit that might change tomorrow. It removes the underlying predictable mechanics of the universe.
Wow. Okay. And the Jafari school rejected that.
Aggressively. The Jafari theology maintained that God is fundamentally just, rational, and created a universe governed by discoverable, consistent laws of cause and effect.
So they needed cause and effect.
By vehemently defending cause and effect as a divine reality, they maintain an intellectual environment where empirical science and philosophy could legitimately and safely operate.
That is a massive distinction. Their theology actively protected the philosophical foundation needed for scientific inquiry. But what about the specific scientific miracles claimed by some followers today?
Ah, the YouTube videos.
Yeah, if you go online, you will find hundreds of videos claiming Imam Jafar al-Sadiq predicted oxygen or atomic theory or the speed of light centuries before Western science. How do we treat those specific claims?
Impartially, our research shows we have to look at how academic critical historians view them. While traditional followers point to these accounts as absolute proof of the Imam's divine infallible knowledge, secular and academic historians view these claims with significant heavy caution.
Because the math doesn't add up.
Because of how the texts are read, academics note that many of these claims involve heavy anachronism, meaning people are reading modern scientific concepts backward into ambiguous, poetic, 8th century Arabic texts.
Like trying to find hidden codes.
Exactly. If an 8th century text talks about the invisible particles of the air, a modern reader might say, look, he predicted oxygen. But a historian says, no, he was talking about ancient Greek concepts of elemental air.
So it's more about modern interpretive apologetics than actual peer-reviewed 8th century data.
Right. Academics argue that Imam Jafar was undeniably brilliant, a generational intellect who taught natural philosophy, but treating his texts as miraculous anticipations of modern chemistry or quantum physics is a stretch.
That makes sense.
However, and this is the key takeaway from the sources, what is historically undeniable is that the culture of inquiry he fostered, the environment that actively encouraged questioning, observation, and rational debate, was incredibly real and changed the course of history.
The culture of inquiry. That phrase brings us directly to the next phase of our research, which brings us to the present day. And this is probably the most sensitive, friction-heavy part of our exploration.
It definitely is.
Because we just spent all this time talking about an 8th century academy that explicitly separated state power from religion in order to survive. We talked about a tradition that demands rigorous human questioning. So what happens when that exact same theology is suddenly handed the keys to a modern 21st century nation-state?
It creates what is arguably the defining crisis and struggle for the Jafari tradition in the modern world.
I'm looking at the sociological data in our stack of sources, specifically the Gavan survey conducted regarding religious demographics in modern Iran. And the numbers are staggering.
The drop in affiliation is huge.
It shows a massive, unprecedented rise in people identifying as atheists or claiming no religion or actively leaving Islam altogether. Ex-Muslims use data like this as definitive, undeniable proof that the Jafari doctrine itself, when finally put into practice at a state level, is fundamentally flawed, oppressive, and is actively pushing people away from God. Are they right? Is the theology itself to blame?
To answer that impartially, we have to look extremely closely at the data and make a hard distinction between theology and political sociology. First, the sources are clear on a global level. There is no reliable, disaggregated data showing that people leave Islam specifically because of Jafari theology at a higher rate than any other Islamic sect globally.
But the Iranian data is real, right? The massive drop in affiliation is actually happening there.
The survey data is real, though sociologists sometimes debate the exact methodologies of polling within a closed country. But the crucial analytical point is why that disaffiliation is happening.
Okay, why is it happening then?
Scholars, sociologists, and even many high-ranking traditional clerics attribute the high rate of secularization and atheism in Iran not to the classical 8th century doctrines of Imam Jafar, but entirely to the political enforcement of religion by the state.
So it's a reaction to the government's heavy hand, not a rejection of the theology itself?
It is a sociological inevitability. When a modern nation-state enforces a specific interpretation of religious jurisprudence as mandatory constitutional law, when it uses the police to mandate dress codes, social behaviors, and political allegiances under the banner of God religion, becomes entirely fused with state power.
Right.
Consequently, when a populace feels deep political frustration, economic suffocation, or desires social rebellion, that political rebellion inevitably, logically manifests as religious rebellion.
Because rejecting the government means rejecting the religion they're holding up as their shield. That makes perfect sense sociologically. If the state says God wants you to obey us, and you hate the state, you end up rejecting God. And the fascinating thing is this stands in incredibly sharp, almost ironic contrast to the classical Jafari approach we talked about earlier.
It is a profound night and day contrast. Remember, Imam Jafar al-Sadiq purposely practiced quietism. He separated spiritual authority from political governance specifically to protect the faith from the corruption, violence, and backlash of state power.
So modern Iran is actually operating on a completely different model than the founder of their own legal school did.
Yes. The political system in Iran is based on a doctrine developed much, much later in the 20th century by Ayatollah Khomeini. It is called Wilayat al-Faqih, or the guardianship of the Islamic jurist.
What does that mean in practice?
It argues that in the modern era, in the absence of the infallible imam, a highly qualified cleric should hold absolute political and executive power to enforce Islamic law over the state.
Does everyone in the Jafari tradition globally agree with that doctrine? Because it seems like a huge leap from quietism.
Absolutely not. It is a highly contested, heavily debated doctrine within the Shia world. In fact, many of the most senior, respected scholars in the Jafari tradition completely reject the idea of clerical political rule.
Like who?
The prime example today is Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, based in the holy city of Najaf, Iraq. He is followed by millions of Twelver Shias globally, and he fiercely maintains the classical, quietist stance of Imam Jafar al-Sadiq.
So Sistani doesn't believe clerics should run the government or hold political office?
Correct. He believes clerics should act strictly as moral guides, spiritual advisors, and protectors of the marginalized, not as heads of state, politicians, or police chiefs.
Well, that's completely different from the Iranian model.
Yes. During the incredible chaos of the Iraq War and its bloody aftermath, Sistani repeatedly intervened to protect democratic processes, constantly urged his followers to vote, and explicitly, forcefully forbade sectarian violence against Sunnis, all while refusing to ever take political office himself.
I think this is a revelation for a lot of listeners. You have the exact same 1,300-year-old legal school reading the exact same texts, producing the supreme leader of an Islamic republic in Iran on one hand, and a quietist, democracy-supporting Grand Ayatollah in Iraq on the other.
It really shows how unbelievably elastic the tradition is.
But speaking of elasticity, how does this open door of ijtihad, this constant updating of the law handle modern social and scientific questions today, are they adapting to the 21st century?
Yes. The mechanism of ijtihad allows modern Jafari scholars to rigorously debate and issue rulings on incredibly complex modern issues, often much faster than other traditions.
Like what? Give me an example.
For example, in bioethics, Jafari jurisprudence has been notably proactive. Using logical deduction based on foundational principles, their scholars have permitted stem cell research, in vitro fertilization, and even complex organ transplantation.
Finding rational pathways within the law to allow for scientific medical advancement.
Exactly.
That covers the science, but what about social issues, specifically women's rights, which are heavily criticized by secular observers and ex-Muslims?
That is an area of intense, ongoing internal debate. You certainly have conservative, traditionalist jurists who defend classical patriarchal rulings regarding inheritance laws or the weight of a woman's testimony in court.
With their pushback.
Absolutely. Because the gates of ijtihad are permanently open, you also have a growing movement of reformist scholars and, critically, female mujtahidas, women who have reached the highest levels of independent legal reasoning, who are actively reinterpreting the foundational texts.
Can you give us a concrete example of that reinterpretation in action? How do they change a law without breaking the religion?
A prime example is the heated debate over the legal age of marriage. Classical texts, written centuries ago in vastly different social contexts, often linked marriageability strictly to the onset of biological puberty.
Which is very problematic today.
Yes. But modern Jafari reformists apply reason to this. They argue that the true, deeper jurisprudential requirement for marriage laid out in the principles of the law is rushed, which means full intellectual, emotional, and social maturity, not merely biological capability.
So they use the principle of the law to update the application of the law.
Exactly. By applying reason and examining the broader ethical objectives of Islamic law, which aim to protect individuals from harm, they effectively argue for modern, older standards of adulthood for marriage, and they do it entirely from within the traditional legal framework. They aren't throwing their religion away, they are using its own tools to evolve it.
So the system has the built-in tools to evolve, depending entirely on who is doing the interpreting and how rigorously they apply their aql. It's a living, breathing mechanism.
Very much so.
Which brings us, I think, to the final section of our research. And in many ways, it brings us full circle. After digging through the bloody history, the theological paradoxes, the scientific legacies, and the modern sociological data, we have to return to the fundamental relationship between the Jafari tradition and the rest of the Muslim world.
The ultimate question of bridging the divide.
Right. We started this entire investigation by asking if Imam Jafar al-Sadiq divided Islam. We proved historically, looking at the timeline, that the fracture happened decades before he was born.
The timeline doesn't lie.
But looking out the window at the world today, the division between Sunni and Shia is incredibly real. In many parts of the Middle East, it is violently destructive. So the question we have to ask is, do modern Jafari scholars actually want unity? Or is sectarianism, the deep-seated us versus them mentality, too deeply baked into their theology to ever truly reconcile?
It is arguably the most urgent, bleeding question facing the global Muslim ummah today. And when we impartially examine the modern sources and the actual output of the highest scholars, it reveals something very different from the news headlines.
Oh, how so?
While deep, very real theological differences remain, significant, concrete, structural steps toward reconciliation have been taken by the highest levels of Jafari scholarship.
What kind of concrete steps? Because all the casual observer usually sees on the news is proxy wars and sectarian violence.
Well, we have to look at the theological flashpoints. Historically, one of the most toxic, volatile flashpoints has been the practice of cursing or verbally insulting the early caliphs Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and the companions and wives of the Prophet.
Right, which goes back to those early civil wars.
Yes. This practice emerged in some Shia circles centuries ago due to the deep historical grievances and trauma we discussed earlier. And obviously, this is a massive, unforgivable red line for Sunni Muslims.
Understandably so.
Yeah.
You can't have unity if one side is openly insulting the most revered figures of the other side.
Precisely. Recognizing this, the top Shia clerics in the world have taken definitive action. Both Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran and Grand Ayatollah Sistani in Iraq have issued explicit, legally binding fatwas religious decrees, strictly, absolutely forbidding the insulting of Sunni symbols, the early caliphs, or any of the Prophet's wives.
Wow. Legally binding fatwas forbidding it.
Yes. Sistani went even further in addressing his followers regarding the Sunni community. He famously instructed them, do not merely call Sunnis your brethren, call them your own soul.
Call them your own soul. Let that sit for a second. That is not just political tolerance. That is a profound, foundational theological statement of unity from the highest possible authority.
It is. And furthermore, on an institutional global level, there have been major ecumenical efforts to codify this unity. The most prominent recent example in our research is the Amman Message of 2004.
What was the Amman message?
This was a massive gathering in Jordan of the world's leading Islamic scholars, Sunni, Shia, Ibadi, across all the major schools. And they produced a document mutually recognizing each other's legal schools as entirely valid expressions of Orthodox Islam.
They officially recognize each other.
Critically, they officially legally forbade takfir, which is the practice of declaring another Muslim to be an unbeliever or apostate.
So the absolute top scholars from both sides have sat down at a table, looked at the theology, and legally declared, we are all Muslims, full stop. If the theology permits unity, why does the conflict still seem so intense on the ground? Why is the Middle East still burning along sectarian lines?
Because, as the political analysts and modern historians in our sources point out, much of the modern Sunni-Shia conflict is actually driven by brutal geopolitics, not theology.
It's just politics.
It is fueled by proxy wars between modern nation-states, most notably the intense rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, who are competing for regional hegemony, oil, and political influence.
So they're just using the 1,300-year-old religion as a weapon to achieve modern political goals.
Exactly. The geopolitical conflicts are heavily layered with a theological veneer. State media uses religious terminology to mobilize populations, rile up anger, and justify political actions.
But the theology itself isn't driving it.
But the actual scholarly debates over 8th century jurisprudence or the exact philosophical nature of the Imarat are not what is driving the violence on the ground. When the history is understood accurately, and when those toxic geopolitical layers are stripped away, the sources show that, alhamdulillah, deep dialogue, mutual respect, and peaceful coexistence are entirely possible within the framework of Islamic diversity.
That is a profoundly hopeful, paradigm-shifting place to land. It completely reframes how we should look at the headlines we see today. We've covered an incredible, massive amount of ground in this research. We've looked at the bloody timeline, debunked the myth of the Great Divider, explored the golden window of Medina where Sunnis and Shia studied together.
We tackled a lot.
We tackled the taboo doctrines of Mut'ah and Taqiyya, examined the Nobel arguments and the science of cause and effect, and faced the modern realities of state theocracy versus quietism.
It is an incredibly complex, multi-layered legacy, but it is one that is undeniably permanently central to human intellectual history.
As we wrap up this exploration, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final fascinating paradox to chew on. We talked about the diagnostic muddy waters at the very beginning, how we, as modern people, like things to be binary and clean. Good guys, bad guys. Right, wrong. But history is gloriously messy.
Very messy.
Think about this. Imam Jafar al-Sadiq built a tradition anchored in the absolute infallible authority of divinely appointed imams, a closed, perfect system of leadership that cannot be questioned. Yet by demanding the relentless use of by keeping the gates of independent reasoning and ijtihad permanently, aggressively wide open, he birthed one of the most intellectually elastic, philosophically curious, and hotly debated traditions in all of religious history.
It's an incredible paradox.
It's a tradition that manages to hold absolute, unquestionable divine authority in one hand and relentless, critical human questioning in the other. How those two opposing forces balance or how they violently collide is the story of this sect. And it's a story that is still being written, argued, and lived today.
A brilliant summation. The tension between divine authority and human inquiry is the engine that keeps their intellectual tradition alive.
May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.